welcome to Wine with Andy. I'm Andy. Today we're getting stuck into our first comparative wine tasting. We're going to be looking at the effects of climate on wine, and we're going to be doing that by tasting one wine from a hotter place against one wine from a cooler place. We're starting off focusing on white wines, so we've got a pair of Unoaked Chardonnays to taste, one from Burgundy in France and one from South Africa or Australia, depending on what you've been able to find in the shops. I've got one from South Africa. Now, I gave a bit of information last time about the wines you'd need to look out for and get to taste along with me in this episode. If you missed that, don't worry, take a look in the description and there's all the information you need down there. Now, the first thing we're going to need to start this tasting is a pair of wine glasses. They need to be the same so that the only thing that's going to be different between them is the wine inside. Now, you're probably used to drinking white wine cold, straight from the fridge. But the cold actually dulls the flavour a little bit. So let's pour ourselves a glass of each of these now and let it warm up a bit whilst I talk a bit more. I'm going to pour the French wine in my left-hand glass and the South African wine I've got here in my right-hand glass. And I'll try to remember which one's which as we go on. If you think you might get confused, you can always grab a pen and write on them so that you can remember. So while the wines are sitting in the glasses warming up a little bit, let's take a look at these bottles. On the French one, the biggest thing on the front label is the name of the place it's from, and that's pretty normal for a European wine. Wine has been made in Europe for a very long time, and over that time, tradition has grown up about what grape varieties are grown in what places. These days, that tradition is codified into law. So I know that a white wine from Mâcon in Burgundy has to be made from 100% Chardonnay grapes. The same is true of Chablis, which is the other wine I suggested looking out for if you couldn't find Mâcon. For the South African bottle, the biggest thing on it is actually the brand name, but beyond that, the next biggest thing is the name of the grape. And that's pretty common for wines not for Europe. They'll lead with the name of the grape variety. That doesn't actually mean necessarily that that wine is 100% Chardonnay. The rules actually vary between countries, but in South Africa, if a wine says Chardonnay on the front of it, it has to be made from at least 85% Chardonnay grapes. The rest can be something else. It could be something that is more cheap to grow to add filler, or it could be something that adds a little bit of extra flavour to change it slightly, to tweak it according to what the winemaker wants to achieve. But because the bulk of the wine is Chardonnay, the bulk of the flavour is going to be Chardonnay flavours. Okay, I reckon these have probably warmed up enough now, so let's get tasting. First things first, we pick them up and have a look to see if we can see any difference in colour. Now these look pretty much the same to me. They're both a sort of fairly golden yellow. That's not surprising, given that the main things that control a wine's colour are the grape variety and the age. These wines are both the same grape variety and both more or less the same age, so we wouldn't expect too much difference. So next step, we've done look, next step is sniff. So pick up the glasses and give them a sniff, one after the other. Try to spot differences, try to start thinking about what kind of fruit, what category of fruit you might be smelling, and then maybe start to narrow it down. So the French one, to me, is quite green and crisp, maybe something like an apple-y kind of a fruit. The South African one has something similar in terms of that appliness, but it's veering towards sort of pineapple. Next step is to give them a swirl and then smell again. So the French one is developing a little bit after I've swirled it. I can smell a bit more intensity of flavours, something a little bit dusty around the edge of it too. On the South African one, I've got a bit more of that sort of pineapple, and again, sort of maybe like sugar syrupy kind of like canned fruit kind of a smell. You come up with anything that you can think of. It's really difficult, like I said before, to come up and put names to flavours. So anything that pops into mind, just go with it, it's fine. Okay, so now that we've done the sniffing and the swirling and sniffing, we move on to tasting it, putting it in the mouth. So take a mouthful, suck it around and swirl it around inside your mouth. So I've still got those flavours. I've got something a bit honey-y in the mouth as well that I can taste. Thinking about the things that we can detect in the mouth that we can't from the nose, there's not really any sugar in this wine. We wouldn't expect to, it's a dry white wine. The acid is kind of medium level. You can feel a little bit of a tingle, or I can feel a little bit of a tingle on the tongue as I hold the wine in my mouth. And the alcohol isn't particularly prominent. I don't really get any burn on my throat as I swallow it. Onto the South African wine. So, a bit more of that sort of pineapple-y fruit, and maybe something like butter caramel, that kind of sweet, almost a little bit sickly kind of a taste. So as well as the type of fruit that you're looking out for, I've said sort of apple-y fruit, maybe a bit more apple, a bit more pineapple, you can think of the ripeness of the fruit. That could be anything on a spectrum from underripe, which would taste green, maybe grassy, maybe vegetal, through nice, just freshly picked, ripe off the tree kind of fruit, through slightly overripe, you know, when a banana's gone slightly soft or your apple's starting to rot a little bit, it has that overripe smell, through to cooked or tinned sort of smells, so things like stewed apple or tinned peaches or jam. Now, thinking about these, I'd say the French one is that kind of freshly picked, nicely ripe, juicy fruit, whereas the South African one is sort of at the overripe towards tinned fruit kind of end. If I think about the fruit flavour as pineapple, it kind of tastes like tinned pineapple. If I think about that fruit flavour as apple, it's more like overripe apple or sort of slightly stewed apple. It's a funny thing about smell and taste. By changing how you're thinking about it, you can change how you perceive it. So I can sort of switch between the two, like one of those optical illusions. Hopefully, you're finding something similar, that the wine from the hotter place, from South Africa or Australia, tastes of fruit that is riper or more tropical, perhaps, than the fruit from the French wine. Let's have a look at why that might be. So this is a map of where my wines are from. You can see that the French one is from kind of the middle of France, and the South African one is from the bottom end of South Africa. Now let's have a look at the temperature in those two places. This is a chart of the average temperature each month, with a range also shown on the chart to show how hot on average and how cold on average it gets that month. The seasons are obviously out of alignment in the northern and southern hemisphere, so they're kind of opposite, which makes it a bit hard to compare. So let's sort of artificially line them up. Now you can see that actually there's not too much difference in the peak of that temperature. South Africa, the wine region in South Africa gets a little bit hotter, but not too much, and certainly the ranges that you can see overlap quite a lot. But that's not actually what matters so much. You see, grapes take time to ripen. So what really matters is the length of the growing season. Grapevines are dormant below about 10 degrees Celsius. So the length of the growing season we can roughly get from looking at where the average temperature pops above 10 degrees. So you can see that in France, that growing season is restricted. whereas in South Africa, there's pretty much no time of the year when the grapevines have to be dormant, actually. So the growing season is a lot longer in South Africa than in France, which means that the grapes can get a lot riper. And that translates to those riper, more cooked kind of flavours. The grapes are getting ripened and cooked in the sun, and the flavours follow along with that. Now, I mentioned the sun. That's another important thing. It's not just all about temperature, because whilst temperature does help, what the plants are actually doing, what the grapevines are actually doing, is taking energy in from the sun. So let's have a look at the energy available. This is a chart of the amount of sunshine in each place. You can see that South Africa is sunnier as well as warmer than France, which also contributes to this riper, more cooked kind of flavour. Now, there's another level of detail beyond the amount of sunshine that we won't really go into detail about here, but it's about the amount of UV light in particular that the grapevines are getting. It's that gives you a suntan, me sunburn, and the grapes that final level of ripeness. And the position of South Africa on the globe means that it gets more UV light than France as well. So that's what accounts for the difference in flavour. Longer growing season, warmer, more sunshine, more UV. But there's no point going to all this trouble thinking about the flavours and why they're there, unless we also think about whether we like them. So go back, have another smell, another taste, and think about which one you prefer. Do you prefer the riper, richer flavours of the South African or Australian wine, or the leaner, crisper flavours of the French wine? And there's no right answer here, it's personal taste. Now that's useful information for the future, because now you know whether in Chardonnay you like riper flavours or less ripe flavours. So next time you're out at the supermarket or the pub or the restaurant and you're looking at two different Chardonnays wondering which one to get, you'll know to go for the one in the hotter place if you prefer the riper flavours, or the cooler place if you prefer the less ripe flavours. And it doesn't just apply to Chardonnay or to these two wines. It applies to other things as well. Which brings me on to the wines you'll need for next time. So next time we're going to be taking another look at climate, but with red wines rather than white wines. You're going to need 2 bottles of Merlot. One of them should be from South Africa or Australia, just like this time, and the other should be from France, from the Bordeaux wine region. Now that one, just like with the Chardonnays, might need a bit of detective work, because of the fact that French wine often doesn't say the grape variety it's made from on the front label. Look out for one that says St Emilion on the front, or check on the back to see what grape varieties it mentions. If Merlot's the first grape variety it lists, or the only one, then you're good. Again, make sure to check the back labels to see that they're not oaked. Really, we don't want to be thinking about the complications of oak at this point. I'll put a bit more information in the description down below on these wines, which I got from Sainsbury's, and also a bit more information on what to look out for. Now, you've probably got a couple of open bottles of wine left, but don't worry, you don't need to drink them up right away. If they're screw cap bottles, you can just tighten up the cap nice and tight, put them in the fridge, and they'll be good for a few days. If they're cork bottles, then you can squidge the cork back in the top, and again, they'll be good for a day or so. Alternatively, you could invest in one of these things. This is a vacuum van or a wine saver. What you do is you put this rubber stopper in the top, and then there's a little valve inside there that allows you to pump out the air inside the bottle. When you've pumped out all of the air, that'll help keep the wine good for longer. So with this stopper in and with all of the air pumped out, it'll probably keep in the fridge for a week or so. Although that assumes I don't drink it in the meantime. So I hope you've enjoyed this first step into comparative wine tasting with me. If you have enjoyed it, please click on the subscribe link down there to keep up with me in future. And I hope to see you next time. Cheers!